Welcome. We're joined by political consultant Eric Hacopian. Eric, thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure.
So, Russia now has a significant presence in Nagorno-Karabakh. What do you think Russia's play is in Karabakh?
You know, sometimes fiction is a better way to explain things. One of the great classics of World War II, of Life and Faith, Vasily Grossman's book, there's a scene in which Stalin is told that the German armies in Stalingrad are surrounded. And he responds by singing this song saying, "Into my hands, you pretty little bird, I won't let you go for anything in the world." So I think the Russian play here is they've had this apple fall in their hand and they're not going to let it go. What that means in practical terms is what we might be witnessing here is we might have a situation where we have an Armenian Armenia and next to a Russian Armenia. Very much like this could be the Abkhazia of the Caucasus in Azerbaijan, because it's very clear that the way the Russians have moved in, the scale of how they're moving in, that this is going to be a footstep for them right in the heart of an area that they want on the relatively cheap side as far as political and military cost. I think we're seeing a complete Russian play here, which I think in the current time, the interests of Putin and the interests of Armenia on this matter might entirely coincide. To the extent that I think if you read through Putin's interview from yesterday, he really wants this agreement enforced and for it to happen, because I think he's going to most likely turn Karabakh into this Russian fortress, which will have the effect of fully protecting the Armenian population there as far as the physical safeties are concerned, but it really changes the dynamics by creating a most likely an Armenian-speaking Russian province in the middle of the Caucasus.
And the issue of status has still not been resolved. The Russian president, Vladimir Putin, did state that the issue of status will be resolved in the future, and has also spoken about the genocide. What do you think about the issue of status?
It's very interesting because whenever you read someone like Putin, you have to read between the lines, but he rarely says some things openly. He has twice in the last month spoken very clearly and very aggressively about the ethnic nature of this conflict and the Armenian grievances in the context of the genocide in a way that, in all fairness, no Western leaders would. I cannot imagine Angela Merkel saying the things that he said in regards to Sumgayit, the genocide, and the Armenian nation's fear of things like that repeating themselves. So he was very clear about that. Now, what his intentions are, they don't need to be noble, but he spoke about them in those terms. The other thing that he spoke about is, if you understand what he's saying, he is insisting that some kind of a status needs to exist here. And this is something that theoretically and rhetorically, on what the Azeris are saying, they are 100% against it. But he seems to be 100% for it. I think he supports the status issue because it will legitimize the Russian presence there. Once you established what is of Karabakh today as a separate entity of any kind, it could be an interim status. For all practical purposes, it would mean that Karabakh, that part of Karabakh, that Armenian Karabakh, is no longer part of Azerbaijan and will never be considered part of Azerbaijan. And to some extent, the day that Aliyev signed that infamous Monday morning, Sunday night agreement, he might not tell his people that, but by allowing peacekeepers in what he claims to be his country, separating one part of it from another, you're already admitting that that's not your country. What other sovereign country would allow peacekeepers to separate one part of your country from the other if you don't really believe that that's no longer your country? So I think Putin will push for the status issue, not for our purposes, but for his own purposes, to establish some legal status for Karabakh as to a separate entity from Azerbaijan, which for our purposes works. And this is not bad to have, because obviously in all those years of negotiations, we were never able to force this issue of status. But now you have a very strong advocate who has enough power, most likely, to make Aliyev say yes when he really wants to say no.
And I want to also ask about this talk and these discussions to do with the borders opening, the border between Armenia and Turkey. We know that there will be a transport corridor between Nakhichevan and the rest of Azerbaijan. And there's also talk about there being another corridor between Armenia and Russia. Can you explain a bit about this?
Well, that gets added on to a corridor between Armenia and Iran via Nakhichevan. Frankly, if this develops, it's all for the good, because it diversifies Armenia's access to the world, Armenia's access to Russia, Armenia's access to Europe, Armenia's access to the Middle East, Armenia's access to Iran. It obviously helps the Turkish access to Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan's access to Turkey. But this is the kind of thing that we should never be against, no matter what context it comes in, because we benefit from it more than the other side, because they have much easier access lines. To the extent that we are not limited to our access to the world via Georgia, that's a good thing. That through the Azeri transportation system we can be in Russia in a short time, that through Nakhchivan we can be in Iran in a short time, especially if the trains start running. Those will change the economic dynamic of this country and this region. And let's not forget, one of the reasons that people want trade routes to open is people who trade with each other are far less likely to go to war with each other, generally, because they have mutual use of each other's systems, and it's a conducive thing for long-term peace. So I think anything that opens up these corridors and allows more access to the rest of the world, and most importantly, does not allow Georgia to have a chokehold on Armenia's access to the world, because Armenia's access to Iran is frankly rather limited. You know, it's an 8-hour drive to get to the border, when if you go through Nakhchivan, you'll be there in 2-3 hours or less. It's very important and it's quite beneficial. So this might be something that, as horrible as the ceasefire deal was, if these negotiations can open up these access routes, I think this, and I think eventually this could mean the opening of the Turkish border, even though that's not part of this discussion, because the Turkish condition has always been, you have to make a deal with the Azeris. Well, you know, if you have a deal with the Azeris, at that point they have no reason to have the borders closed. Now, whether they open it or not is a different matter. Whether it's good for us for them to open it is a different matter. We're not sure about that. But having more transportation options to be integrated into the greater economies of the Middle East and Europe, nobody can be against that.
And finally, I want to ask, many feel that the West was sidelined from this whole peace agreement. And I want to know how you think the West will react to what Russia's doing right now in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Well, this is from the Western perspective. First of all, the nature of any discussions and negotiations have changed, because the parameters before were some kind of you give away the occupied territories for status of some kind. Well, there's no more occupied territories. In fact, our territories are occupied in Artsakh proper. So what is there to discuss in these negotiations except two things? One is to normalize this current process so people can live in peace, go back to what is left of Karabakh in peace and live in peace there and security, hopefully with some kind of status that protects them internationally. And the issue of their human rights, of does Azerbaijan has a right to rule over these people. So the discussions that there are to be had are almost all favorable to us, because they're about pressing the Azeris to give us something they don't want to give, which is status. There's not much else to discuss outside of normalizing this current system, i.e. access roads, security, peace, And then the issue of status. At that point, either Azerbaijan gives in, and you can settle this issue, most likely, or if they don't give in, it becomes the equivalent of what we went through with the last 30 years, except them holding more cards like we did for 30 years. But then what did that lead to after 30 years? And the tables can turn in 20 years. So there's actually some incentives for Azerbaijan to make a deal here and wrap this issue up if they were to give the rest of Karabakh status, especially if it means they get to keep what they have occupied in Karabakh proper, i.e. Shushi or Hadrut. But that really depends on internal Azeri politics and the Turkish influence on it. But coincidentally, as I think Putin is going to be pushing for status for his own purposes, the Western powers might very well be pushing for status for their own purposes. Because if they don't want an uncertain situation that Putin responds to by giving every Karabakhsi a Russian passport, as they did in Abkhazia, because you can recognize it or not recognize it. But if the 150,000 people in Karabakh have Russian passports along with their Armenian passports, nobody in Baku would dare do anything against the Karabakhsis, because Russia cannot let 150,000 of its citizens go unprotected. So it's one and the same. The West might very well push for recognition of some kind to preserve the independence of Karabakh for it not to become Abkhazia. So you could have a situation that West and East push for the same thing for entirely different reasons, which could be entirely favorable to us. This obviously requires us to have the diplomatic skill to be able to balance this out and make it work. But I was encouraged with what Putin's comments were yesterday, because I think it serves our interests. And hopefully it could spur the Western pushback that will essentially lead to the same thing, which is any level of status. Because in reality, in this context, any level of status for Artsakh makes it an independent country no matter what Aliyev tells his people. And I think on that infamous night where we all dreaded that horrendous ceasefire, the historical effect of that might be that's the first step towards the Azeri recognition of the independence of Artsakh.
Well, Eric, thank you very much for your time again.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.